I am really happy to welcome tonight Dr. John Rogers, who is a professor of education and associate dean for research and public scholarship in the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. Dr. Rogers serves as the director of UCLA's Institution for Democracy, Education, and Access. He studies issues of democracy, education, and has written a lot about students, parents, and school leaders in educating toward a multiracial democracy. He is regularly featured in local, state, and national media, and he produces a weekly newsletter, which you might all want to check out, called Just News, that highlights important issues related to education and justice. He is recipient of the American Educational Research Association's Presidential Citation. He has his PhD in education from Stanford University and a BA in Public Policy and African American Studies from Princeton.
Hello. Thank you, Julie, and thank you for inviting me to join you. I feel privileged to be part of this group and to be in dialogue with you this evening. I've been following the work of Red, Wine, and Blue since its founding. I believe yours is one of the most important groups in the nation supporting public schools to educate for a diverse, multiracial democracy. I'm pleased to be here because we're gathering at a consequential moment. The administration, which began yesterday, is sure to present new challenges to public education and democracy. It's interesting to note that education policy received little to no attention during much of the presidential campaign. But in the final phase, a father asked Donald Trump during a Fox and Friends interview how he would fix America's schools. Mr. Trump replied, "No transgender, no operations. There are some places your boy leaves the school, comes back a girl, okay, without parental consent." Now, that was a bald-faced lie, but it was far from the first time Trump and a wide range of conservative activists have leveraged fears related to the well-being of school children. Over the last 4 years, we've witnessed a coordinated, highly funded, and intentional political strategy targeting America's public schools. I've been working with a team of university researchers from around the country to track this conflict campaign and its consequences on young people and public education. Before turning to a big picture of what we found, let me share one superintendent's story. Stephen Machi is an award-winning superintendent of a mid-sized school district who I interviewed this past summer. Dr. Machi told me that historically, school board members in his district had been moderate Republicans who, quote, care about kids and trust the district leaders, unquote. But recently, a couple new board members who he characterizes as extremists have been elected with support from Moms for Liberty. These new board members use social media to challenge the district's LGBTQ plus policies and attack individual educators. Quote, they are spreading false propaganda, fear-mongering, unquote. The length of the board meetings has grown from 90 minutes to 5.5 hours, and much of this time is taken up by speakers claiming that local schools are, quote, indoctrinating kids with ideologies around sexual health, unquote, even as the district uses the state-approved curriculum. Dr. Machi agonizes, quote, it's gotten incredibly contentious. They're just trying to disrupt. For Dr. Machi, this awful behavior is not just disruptive, but also very expensive. In the 2023-24 school year, the district spent an additional $100,000 for security, hiring armed plainclothes off-duty officers, quote, because people coming to the board meetings are unpredictable and sometimes violent, unquote. The district's incurred more than $500,000 in legal fees associated with lawsuits stemming from one trustee's campaign against the LGBTQ plus community. Attacks on this community at board meetings have led a social service agency to withdraw nearly $250,000 of in-kind services for district students. Similarly, a local technology company that had provided roughly $150,000 a year to the district withdrew its partnership, saying, we don't like being talked about negatively at your public meetings. The district also has faced additional costs in excess of $80,000 for recruitment and development of new staff members to replace teachers counselors and administrators who left their positions because they didn't want to work in such a divisive setting. These direct budgetary costs are dwarfed by the more than $1 million in staff time last year that was focused solely on grappling with the heightened conflict. Dr. Machi estimates that 20 staff each spent 20 hours a week responding to media inquiries and addressing misinformation and falsehoods, fulfilling Public Record Act requests, and more. Quote, our staff are spending enormous amounts of time just doing stupid stuff, producing things that serve nobody, unquote. Dr. Machi concludes, the fiscal costs of the district are enormous, but so are the cultural costs of not standing up to the extremists. If somebody doesn't, then the students and employees lose. It's the worst it's ever been. Julie, if you can move forward the slide to the one that has 2 questions on it.
Yes, we are there. Just let me know when you want me to change the slides. Sorry, I'm admitting people and moving the slides accidentally.
Of course. So a few months ago, we launched this national study to assess the fiscal costs of conflict associated with the divisive fights that have become so prevalent. We had 2 research questions. First, how common are the kind of dynamics that Superintendent Machi experienced? Is this just a singular story, or is this common across the country? And then our second question is, how much is it costing schools and school districts to respond to all this conflict? To address these questions, we surveyed 467 district superintendents across 46 states. We also interviewed 42 superintendents across 12 states. So we got a broad picture of what was going on across the United States. Next slide. Our survey and interviews asked superintendents about the extent to which their school districts are experiencing culturally divisive conflict, as well as the costs of such conflict that their districts incurred during the last school year. We define culturally divisive conflict as conflicts that are about 1, teaching about issues of race and racism, 2, about rights and protection for LGBTQ plus students, and 3, students' access to books in their school libraries. We also focus particular attention on when those conflicts were accompanied by the spread of misinformation, hostile or violent rhetoric, and threatening behavior. The next slide then. So in the survey, we asked the superintendents about the degree to which their schools and communities were experiencing those forms of conflict. Almost all superintendents reported some levels of conflict, and 2/3 reported what we describe as moderate or high levels of culturally divisive conflict. And when the districts were experiencing high levels of conflict, it was almost constant as a dynamic in the district. Next slide, please. This table that the next slide shows indicates how much districts that are enrolling on average 10,000 students spent last year responding to culturally divisive conflict. Now, there's a lot going on in this table. Let me break it down for you. We include direct costs when the districts paid for additional services like additional security or additional legal counsel. And we also include indirect costs when the districts deployed staff time to address different problems. And you'll see that there are different types of costs or different types of problems that were addressed. So there's security, costs related to media, costs related to social media, to legal, to community relations, et cetera. And it breaks it down about when we see the costs for districts that experience low conflict, moderate conflict, and high conflict. So how much does all this amount to? If we go to the next slide, we see in this chart an estimate for districts of roughly 10,000. And if your district has 20,000, you can kind of double these figures. If it has 5,000, you can half these figures. So 10,000 provides a kind of a neat way to look at the average cost for an average size school district in the United States. The districts that experience moderate levels of conflict, they spent roughly $500,000 a year, or almost $500,000 a year, Districts that experienced high conflict spent more than $800,000 a year. Now, we put all these figures together and looked across the United States and added it all up. And the total amount that we estimate that was spent on culturally divisive conflict last year is $3.2 billion, billion with a B. Next slide, please. I've been focusing on the financial costs, which are critically important, but I also just want to note that culturally divisive conflict has had a terrible effect on mental health, staff attendance, and how community members think about their public schools. For example, one Suburban superintendent commented, "The undermining of public trust and government operations is being intentionally inflicted on our population, and many people do not realize the long-term effects this will have on our nation." Next slide, please. So I want to close it before we get to Q&A with a couple questions that Dr. King posed in his 1967 book, as we need Dr. King's wisdom and moral clarity today more than ever. He asked, where do we go from here, and chaos or community? When I talk with most educators and community members, their message is clear. They want public schools that are welcoming and foster a sense of belonging for all students. They want young people to be able to engage with the full history of the country and with controversial issues in ways that center evidence, reflection, discussion, and civility. To feature such programs in schools, educators need broad public support. Educators need the public to be engaged and to have their backs. Parents and community members should talk regularly about what they appreciate about educators' work and the importance of treating all students with dignity and respect. And if politicians, school board members, parents, or others enact conflict campaigns aimed at disrupting and undermining trust, then it's vital that the public speaks out against them. If local communities can help put the conflict entrepreneurs out of business, educators can focus on improving learning. Young people will feel safer and more supported, and schools might just save millions and perhaps even billions of dollars. Thank you, and I look forward to engaging in Q&A with you all.
Can you explain to people who are listening, what's the difference between, like, how did you define a high conflict district versus a low conflict district?
So again, I want to make 2 points here. One is that we focus not just on conflict, but culturally divisive conflict. So we asked superintendents all across the country in the survey whether there was conflict in their district that tried to limit what students were learning about, particularly race and racism, whether there was conflict in the districts that tried to restrict students' rights, particularly rights around LGBTQ plus issues, and conflict that tried to limit students' access to books. And we also asked superintendents about whether there was efforts to mislead and present misinformation, whether there was threatening rhetoric, particularly at school board meetings, and whether there was actually violence playing out in school districts. Depending upon the responses to those questions, we were able to categorize districts as either experiencing really high levels of conflict, so that they were having conflict around all those issues and almost constantly, or moderate levels of conflict when it was either one or two of those issues and they would occasionally have those problems, or some districts only on rare moments had those issues arise, and those were low conflict districts. So that's how we describe districts as having high or moderate levels of culturally divisive conflict. And I just want to emphasize that conflict in and of itself is not a bad thing. I started off with that photo of Dr. Martin Luther King, and certainly he invited and welcomed civic engagement, and he saw such civic engagement as a key to societal transformation. But that form of civic engagement differs from the culturally divisive conflict in the sense that it was aimed at creating a beloved community. It was not aimed at dismissing members of the community, denying their dignity. And it always sought to enact civic engagement with mutual respect and civil discourse.
So I think that was actually one of the questions, and I think you've kind of clarified that, but you say in the study that like you actually work in the notion that there's always going to be some cultural division in schools. There's going to be parents who don't agree on what books should be taught. There's going to be discussions about curriculum. And so you kind of built that into the study because there's always a little bit of a cost, but that's actually part of the democratic process. And we're talking about culturally divisive actual contention, political contention here. Am I accurate in what I'm saying?
That's exactly right. I mean, I see that there's, more than 600, more than 700 people in this webinar right now. You all are here out of your civic commitment, out of your sense of care for our public schools. That's exactly what we need. We want people to have a desire to shape the public sphere, to shape the experiences young people have in public schools. But we want folks to do that with the goal of building our shared institution. We want folks to see each other with respect and to acknowledge the dignity of all members of our community.
Okay, thank you. And as you all are listening, please feel free to drop questions you have in the chat. We will ask those questions at the end once we hear from our other speakers. So when we hear in the news, which we do a lot, about contentious school boards, it makes sense to me that like, sure, they might have to hire more security for that school board meeting, or heck, there may be lawsuits and that means legal fees. But you talk a little bit about hidden costs, and you've kind of touched on those, like corporations that don't want to work with the school district anymore, or um, things like staff time. But can you explain like what are those hidden costs that like the general public may just not think about, that your school district is actually losing time or paying out of their funds?
But these range widely. I'll give you a couple examples from one district in the South, a large school district, where the superintendent told me he ended up hiring an additional staff member who spent all of their time addressing efforts by community members who are trying, in his words, to hijack the district platforms, social media platforms, with misinformation. So he had this one staff member whose sole job was to clean up the misinformation and to present the accurate truth, because that misinformation was damaging the community and damaging the schools. He also shared that the number of public record requests that had played out in his district rose from 150 a year to 600 a year. And that meant that he had to turn a number of different staff members to respond to these public records requests. Now, interestingly, he said that after the requests were made, he saw that they weren't ever made use of. So he said that these hours were just wasted, and it made staff feel like their time wasn't really valued. So those are just two examples. There are myriad different examples of how expenditures are made or how staff time was redeployed in ways that served no purpose except to ease some of the crisis that was created by this conflict.
Okay, so and we'll make sure people get a copy of your study, because I think it is interesting to talk to your friends and your neighbors about the things that they're not thinking about, like just having to respond to multiple parents' concerns. That takes up a lot of the superintendent's or the principal's time. Media requests, reporters trying to call. I mean, there's just so many things that are maybe not thought through. That's the one thing I did want to ask you about too. Is you did talk a lot about staff turnover. What was the impact that you saw or heard during the study about the about staff in the schools and recruiting new staff?
It, Staff turnover is an incredibly expensive problem because it means that you have to recruit new staff, you have to spend time with professional development for new staff. All of that costs the district a substantial amount of money. It's also the case that folks were leaving districts because they felt like they could no longer remain healthy and stay in that district. So in the high conflict districts, almost all superintendents reported that staff in their district were experiencing mental health problems as a result of the conflict. One of the superintendents we interviewed said that all of his deputies were on blood pressure medicine across the district. Another superintendent talked about the incredible stress on leaders and teachers as they navigate imaginary slights and online drama in the community. And yet another superintendent, this one was from Wyoming, said It's like the shift from how public schools used to be seen as a positive, a way to serve every child, a way to bring us together. Now we're being vilified. And that's so hurtful. I think that contributes to my staff's stress.
And I remember, I believe there was something in your report about the fact that then trying to recruit people into the district became really difficult because if your school is front and center in the newspaper and a new recruit's looking at that, they're going to be like, thanks, but no thanks.
I think that's exactly right. And it's striking that this was true for teachers, it was true for principals, but it also was true for administrative assistants. So one superintendent talked about her 60-year-plus-year-old administrative assistant who experienced extraordinary stress because after a story went on social media, which was false about their district was bombarded with phone calls, and they were oftentimes extremely hostile to her as the person taking the calls. And so the superintendent talked about this administrative assistant crying because of what people were saying to her and feeling like she couldn't remain in her job.
Wow. So as you went through the study and talked to staff and administrators all over the country, what did they say about their community's recognition of these financial costs? Like, did the general public, did the taxpayers, the parents, did they really understand how much this was costing their districts, or did that seem kind of, you know, something elusive that they didn't really grasp?
So very few of the superintendents we talked to noted that members of the community were aware of the costs. I think in part, school districts have not done the best job to date of communicating the financial impact of some of this conflict. So many community members were aware of the conflict, were deeply disturbed by the conflict, but they didn't have the factual information about the increased costs to security, the increased legal costs, the redeployment of staff time, et cetera, to be able to raise their concerns. And so it wasn't framed in this way. You had community members disturbed, but without the information where they could bring those issues to bear.
And then final question, and then we're going to jump in here from, like I said, a school board member and a former, well, still a teacher, but a former high school teacher, about their districts and how they experience what you're talking about. But last question is, so the schools are having all these unforeseen costs. Where are they getting the money to pay for it? And what impact does that have on student learning?
Great question. So in many cases, the funds were coming from general fund dollars, which means that the loss of those funds needed to come from somewhere else. When staff were spending time doing this work, responding to the crisis, it meant that they were not able to support learning. So many of the superintendents talked about their own sense of loss not being able to advance learning. Here's a superintendent from Kentucky who said, the politicization of public schools that began during the pandemic has changed our work dramatically. Much more time must be spent dealing with misinformation and angry individuals. This is time that would be better spent on supporting teaching and learning. And we heard that again and again, that the opportunity cost for superintendents, principals, teachers, counselors of having to redirect their work in this way meant that they weren't able to help young people feel like they belonged, help young people to learn, create the sorts of schools that we want.
All right, well, Dr. Rogers, thank you so much for sharing this information and for the study, and we will make sure people get a copy of that to read. Right now, I'm going to bring Julie up, and we will bring up our two other guests.
All right. Well, welcome, Aletha and Lauren. Aletha, you are from Katy, or you were in Katy, Texas for 4 years. Saw a lot of discrimination in hiring, non advancement of non-white staff in your district, and books like Ruby Bridges and Michelle Obama's books were being banned. And then Lauren, you're on the school board in Mentor and you just finished your first year. Um, but you have two extremists on your board. One's a homeschooler and you were elected with the second person who is doing the extreme things, and they follow the Moms for Liberty book ban list, is what I'm seeing here. So can you share what has been happening in the extremism in your school districts? I know that Lisa, you're in Houston now, right? Houston?
Yeah, so mine is very interesting. I live in Conroe ISD. Um, I am a professor for Texas Tech, and so I actually have students who are teacher residents in Houston Independent School District, and but I used to work for Katy Independent School District. So I am all over the place kind of in the Houston area. But yeah, so with the book banning that ended up happening in Katy, that is part of the reason why I decided to leave being a teacher and actually ended up becoming the professor that I did at Texas Tech. And so one of the reasons is because, I mean, I had a Dr. Seuss book in my classroom, and the kids were never going to read this Dr. Seuss book, but we still had to submit any book that was in our classroom that the kids were going to be exposed to. And I thought this was the most silliest thing in the whole entire world because I'm like, they're not ever going to read this book. It was decoration, um, just decoration in the classroom because my room was decorated as Dr. Seuss. And I still had to submit it to just get approved for it just to sit in my classroom. And then I had another book that my mother used to read to me as a child, and it was a science book, and it said the value of believing in yourself. And again, children were not going to read this book, but I still had to submit it to be approved to just sit in my classroom. So that was after that, I was just like, I'm done. I can't do this no more because if I have to get books approved to just sit in my classroom where kids aren't even going to read it, this and the fact that they think I'm a chemistry teacher and I'm teaching woke ideology as a chemistry teacher, and I'm just teaching kids to do chemistry. I got to go somewhere else. And so I left Katy and then started focusing on Conroe ISD and noticed what Conroe was doing was exactly what Katy was doing. And I was just like, this is crazy. I cannot believe we're like banning all these books and it's bad. And then HISD was just getting rid of all of their librarians and they don't even have libraries at this point. And so I was just like, I was like, can we win somewhere? Can the kids read a book somewhere? That's all I just want. Can they read a book? It's just a book.
Lauren, what about you? Can you share what's been happening in with the extremism in your school district?
Definitely. So first, I want to thank you for having me and thank Dr. Rogers for doing this study. I am sad that I didn't know it existed until now. So thank you for your good work. So I'm in Menor, which is about a half hour outside of Cleveland. We're buried in snow and cold up here too. Sympathize with you all. So our problem started a few years ago, right after the COVID pandemic. And honestly, like the narrative that you shared at the top of your presentation, that could be us. I mean, that is a mirror image. We are generally a pretty red county. We had a pretty moderate Republican school board, but I think there were a couple of Democrats on it before, but primarily very sleepy meetings until COVID hit, and then it just sort of took off from there. I was a parent. I grew up in this town, but I was a parent. I have 2 kids in the system. And after seeing all of this craziness, I was inspired to run. And so I've been serving for a year, as Julie mentioned. It has not gotten better. It has only gotten worse. And the cost that you mentioned, I mean, the media attention alone has been wild to see. We've been featured in the Washington Post. We've been all over local media. Usually it's for book ban situations. There have been books that they've highlighted, that one about Colin Kaepernick at the elementary school level, Beloved by Toni Morrison, all of the books that have been hot items of conversation in the media are pretty much what they've honed in on our school board. So book bans, definitely. The latest topic now are flags, pride flags specifically being displayed in our buildings. But we are seeing a lot of additional costs, have been for years. And in fact, the legal fees is something that I've zeroed in on in our last 2 school board meetings, because we've seen them skyrocket. And those are identifiable costs that we can point to say, hey, look at this. We saw a 62% increase in legal fees to just a single board attorney from 22 to 23. You know, and then it's going up even still this current year. And we're only halfway through the year. So legal fees, additional meetings. You had mentioned one of your superintendents saying that, you know, you're having 5-hour meetings. So are we. 4 or 5-hour meetings. And if we don't get the business of the board done in that period of time, because we're spending so much time talking about culture wars, you know, we have to have another meeting. That's an additional meeting during which we have to be paid with taxpayer money. And that drives our costs up as well. Certainly security fees. We have to have police officers at every single meeting because we've had death threats. We have folks in the audience who are, as you said in your words, unpredictable. And we've had threats of violence. We have folks following us home in our cars. So we have police officers, 3 of them usually at every meeting, and we pay them by the hour, and they have to be at every meeting at which we have public speakers. Of course, staff time to respond to things like public record requests, which have skyrocketed. And I want to be clear, like, people on all sides of the arguments make those public records requests. They have every right to, but it is buried our CFO in requests that he has to then respond to, and then pull the tech team in so that then they have to go and redact all of the private and confidential information. That takes time. That is, in a CFO, to be clear, should not be spending his time redacting public records. He should be doing the work of the CFO. Things like, the recent laws that have been passed in Ohio. Ohio is one, of the most gerrymandered states in the country, and we are dominated by one party, and that party has really come for public education in all kinds of ways, including a voucher program that I won't even get into, but definitely, undermining the work of public schools has helped propel vouchers to the front of their crusade against public education. And so they've been passing laws like bathroom bans and locker room bans that we now have to figure out how to comply with, and that's going to take money and time to figure that out. Staff time to flag and inventory all of our books to determine which ones are inappropriate or sexually explicit. We have one person in charge of a collection of tens of thousands of books, and paying that individual and her team to inventory all those books to find out which ones are going to be inappropriate according to some subjective opinions. There's a cost attached to that too. And I want to add too, I know we're talking about fiscal costs, but I want to add too, because this is why I ran, was to help focus the board on the real issues that we're facing. We've got, bus driver shortage, we've got teacher shortages, we've got space shortage. We have a lot of issues that we have to deal with. So there are a lot of opportunity costs involved too. When we have to take our eye off the ball to deal with culture wars, we're not able to address the real problems in our district that we could be addressing effectively. So that's part of what put me here in the first place.
So, and I've heard, Aletha, you're from the teacher perspective, how it affected you, and you actually came out of the profession altogether. Lauren, you're also a parent. How is this affecting the kids?
Yeah, I mean, my kids I have one in high school and one still in elementary school. The elementary schoolers are usually pretty oblivious, but I will say our high schoolers are paying attention. And our meetings are live streamed, they're recorded, they're up on YouTube on our school. You're welcome to take a look at them. They're all on there, but the kids, they don't necessarily attend, but they watch. They watch the recordings, they watch the live stream. And we've heard from some of them, and some of them are really concerned with what we're doing, right? With the things that we're doing on the board. Some of them feel personally threatened. They might be members of the LGBTQ community. They might know someone, or they might have parents who are, so there are a lot of concerns the kids have. And I will say, by and large, I don't think I've heard from too many students about how they want to ban books. I will tell you that. But they're paying attention, and I think they want to see much better modeling of behavior. They want us to behave in the way we expect them to. I have heard that, which breaks my heart. And I know that we have to set better examples for our kids. I'm not always great at it either, but I do believe we have a lot of work to do on our board, and we could do a lot better.
Well, and you have already shared, the types of things that are increasing costs in your district with the legal fees and such. Aletha, did you have any idea how it cost the districts that you worked in? What did
Yeah.
you see rising?
Oh, most definitely. I also want to say too, like, as far as for kids, I mean, just as she said, high schoolers are speaking out at board meetings. And so if they're speaking out at board meetings, they're just like adults. They want to see some change. And if they're not seeing the change, then what's happening is they're like, well, what's happening to the democratic process? Because they're learning these things in their government classes. And so they're like, okay, you're telling us, speak our voices, speak out, do these things, but they're still banning our books. They're still doing these things. It's not working. So why am I speaking out if it's not working? And so what are we supposed to do on that situation? We're teaching our kids to speak their voices, to speak out, to speak at school board meetings, to speak their voices and do the work, the grassroots work, but they're noticing that the grassroots work is not working for them. And then the other thing is we notice that for our younger kids is everybody says there's a literacy issue. Well, why do we have a literacy issue? These kids can't read. These kids can't read. Oh my gosh, our kids can't read. These teachers aren't teaching the kids to read. You're taking all the books out, or you're getting rid of librarians, or the kids can't go get a library book. So what are you expecting to happen? What's the cause here? And the effect is going to be they can't read. We have a literacy issue now. So I don't know what they're expecting to happen if you're taking all the books out of the schools. They're not going to read. They're not going to be able to read. Teachers don't have autonomy in their curriculum anymore because you're telling teachers what to teach. So what are we getting? Where are we getting now? Teachers aren't getting that. Well, I want to teach this and I want my students to read this book and I want my students to learn this. Teachers don't have that anymore. So when you're taking all of this autonomy away from teachers and then you want these kids to be like geniuses, they're not going to be geniuses and they're not going to be great at literacy when you're taking that one thing away from them. Kids are going to read things that they're interested in. They're not going to read things that we're forcing onto them. So you're taking a lot of the books away that may interest a child. So why are we taking away things that are going to interest a child for them to want to read? And so when you're talking about cost, I can tell you about cost. It is a sub issue all the way around. When I left the classroom, they could not find nobody to take my position. And so there was a sub for the rest of the year. Parents do not want a sub for the years for their kids. They do not want to have a sub after a sub after a sub after a sub after a sub because their kids are not learning from a sub. So that is not what's happening there. And also, since I'm in, work with students who want to be teachers, I can tell you last year, we had high numbers of students who wanted to be teachers. This year, I have five students who want to be teachers. Wow. Our numbers are dropping lower and lower and lower. And the reason our numbers are dropping is because they're seeing the issues that are happening in schools. And they're like, I don't want to have to deal with that because they're going to think that I'm teaching these kids not to love America. They're going to think that I'm teaching woke ideology, and I don't want to have to deal with parents that think I'm teaching woke ideology, and I just want to teach kids to read, and I just want to teach kids to write, and I just want to teach kids to do just the fundamentals. But they don't want to go through the contentious that is happening out there. And I don't think that people who are in these extremism understand we're losing teachers by the batches. And when you're losing teachers and you only have subs and you're paying subs every single day, that's a lot of money that you're paying out to a sub. And if you don't have subs, then you have classrooms that you're combining together. And now you got teachers who don't want to have 30 kids with another set of 30 kids sitting in a classroom together and they're trying to teach. But that is where we're going because of the fact that, one, they don't want to give money to education, especially in Texas. They didn't give money this year. So we didn't have money this year. And now the only way Texas can get money is if they buy into this Bible curriculum that they have where they're going to give you $60 per kid.
I just want to agree with you and add one point about our students. One thing I should have mentioned too is I'm awesome that you have, or that you're hearing of students who are willing to come to school board meetings and speak. We've had a couple, but honestly, I think they refrain from coming because it's not safe. And the other thing, you know, we have had at least one student, a very brave one, asked to be sort of like, he wants to start a student ambassador group or a liaison group to the board, which I think is brilliant. But right now we're worried it's not safe, right? So it's not only that they're being scared away from school board meetings and the teacher profession. I mean, it's that as well. And then I'll also add, it's not just students, it's school board candidates, right? It takes, right now, we're moving into an election year. We are in an election year where we're going to have 3 seats up for re-election. And it's hard to find candidates because it is not exactly a safe endeavor. And I can vouch for that. So it's scaring away people on all sides.
Wow. Well, I want to thank both of you for sharing with us tonight your experiences here in Ohio as well as in Texas. And this is really going on everywhere. I've seen a lot of folks talking about Pennsylvania in the chat. I've seen some of the things happening in Pennsylvania. I know things are happening in Michigan. It's just really all over the country. So thank you so much for sharing. I want to move into the questions now, Julie, if that's all right with you.
Perfect. And I'll leave everybody up here and bring Dr. Rogers back up and we can go. And I did see them moving through the chat. You guys, chat's pretty busy.
Yes.
So I hope that, you know, there is so much, there are so many issues at school boards going on. And like we said, we want people to run, we want students to use their voices. So I will say again, please take the information you learned tonight and go talk to community members because, you know, the one thing that almost everybody gets mad about is when their taxpayer dollars are being wasted. So no matter what side, you know, your politics are on, I think that's something that most people agree with. So Julie, I know there were several questions in the chat.
And wasting those dollars, I mean, think of the teachers and the buildings and the stuff that could be bought with those billions of dollars that are truly being wasted. Someone asked about a way to get John's newsletter or Dr. John's newsletters.
Yes. So 2 things I would say. One is if you Google UCLA IDEA or UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, you will find on the publications page the recent report, as well as several other reports that have been documenting the way that political conflict is shaping life in America's public schools. The Just News weekly newsletter, if you Google Just News from Center X, Just News from Center X, you'll go onto it, and then there's a free subscription that you can click on. It'll ask for your email, and every week on Friday, you will get a set of news articles and research pieces that are addressing issues of education and justice across the United States and across the globe.
Is the point of all of this to create chaos, or is it to cost money, or is it both?
I want to acknowledge that some folks who are raising a ruckus are doing it because they are concerned about their kids. I don't agree with their stance, but I think there are some people that are authentically trying to protect their children. I also think that a lot of people have been misled by media, social media, Fox News, and others to believe that there's a crisis that largely is completely made up. I think that that crisis serves certain partisan interests. Steve Bannon, way back in 2021, in spring of 2021, when the attacks on so-called critical race theory emerged, said, this is the pathway to a congressional majority in the midterms. And so I think that frame helps us to understand that this isn't coming out of nowhere. There are conservative legal networks, conservative philanthropies, conservative politicians, and conservative media who've been cohering around this agenda. And I think that's deeply troubling.
That kind of actually almost partially answers the question of how does this correlate to dismantling the Department of Education? Well, they're putting the people in place to do it. It sounds like what you're saying.
I think so. I also think that disruption serves an agenda that says that we as a society can't come together and cooperate with one another across lines of difference, across lines of race, and build something beautiful together. And that's Dr. King's vision. And I think it's important that we had one narrative yesterday of what yesterday was about. If we go back to yesterday being Dr. King's birthday, we can remember that we have this agenda where we have to work together and see our public schools as a place where we build a common future together. And I think that this disruption aims to undermine our belief that we can do that.
How do folks, parents, teachers, everyone who cares about kids get ahead of these issues from these national groups? What should they be doing?
I saw in the chat there was a question about which organizations nationally can we be part of. So clearly Red, Wine, and Blue is one such organization. I saw someone reference the ACLU. I think you want to touch into any organizations that you're part of or that your people are part of. So faith organizations in your local community, national organizations like the ACLU, or someone referenced PAN America, and other organizations that may not be wholly sympathetic with you politically, like your local PTA or PTSO, and try to reshape them and try to have them reaffirm their commitment to the role of public schools in building a multiracial democracy, because that's what public schools are supposed to be for. And at certain moments in our history, that's what they've been, but we need to reclaim that. We need to join that struggle to make them that.
Piggybacking off of what you said, I highly recommend for the folks on the call tonight to join our troublemaker training sessions, because we do show you how to fight extremism at the school board level. How do you know if the superintendent is in lockstep with the board? Some folks are having trouble differentiating whether or not the superintendent is an ally or not.
Lauren might have thoughts on that.
Well, I'll just say, don't forget that the superintendent reports to the board, right? And the CFO as well. So technically we're their bosses. And so it's really difficult. They're playing a very difficult game. And just because they may not be forthcoming with their feelings or thoughts doesn't mean that they agree with what's going on if there is chaos there. I mean, I can only speak to our two, and I know they just want to do their jobs. Honestly, they just want to have strong schools. They're committed to that. And it's a very difficult line to walk. That's all I can say.
So how would we find out how much our individual districts are spending on this? There were a lot of individual district questions in the chat. Some were so specific that it doesn't really, I don't know that it works in this setting.
You can estimate the projected cost to your district by taking the size of your district and for what I was characterizing as high conflict districts. So if in your district there have been constant conflicts, as Lauren was saying was true of her district, and I think Alita was saying of her district, there's been constant conflicts and lots of misinformation being spread, some threatening behavior, I would call that a high conflict district. Then you can say that for each student in the district, there was roughly $80 spent on the costs of conflict last year. So if it's 100,000 students, that's a huge district. That would be $8 million. I think I'm doing that right. So you have to, I would do it that way. If it's a moderate level of conflict, then it's roughly $50 or so per student.
I'll add too, if you're looking for specific costs, I hate to point you toward public records because I know that costs time and energy, but that is how you can get, specific costs of what your district's spending on things.
Okay. Someone asked if Moms for Liberty is in other areas. Yes, it's in a lot of different areas. Let's see.
They're a huge pack. So they're a big pack that will go for school board seats. And that's how a lot of school board members are getting the seats.
Well, there's one left. How do you bring these kind of it says, how do you bring this up to school boards without putting them on the defense? But I didn't know what they meant by bringing what up. And I don't know if they're still here either, but if you want it, I guess they're talking about how to combat it, which is a whole different night's subject for us. But what kind of what can you give us that you would want us to know?
Lauren may have some better advice than I do on this. I just want to say one thing, which is our systems of communication have become so corrupted through social media that I worry about using social media too much. I think that we need to return to the role of one-on-one conversations in a democracy as a way to build trust and social understanding, and to try to meet people where they are, to build empathy, and to pass on information in ways that are going to be trustworthy. So that's where I would start with a school board member, but Lauren may have some better ideas as someone in that position herself.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a couple of ideas I've been working on. One is, well, we did a community survey and a parent survey just to kind of gauge where opinions were. That was super helpful, gave us a lot of good information. But I completely agree. Dialoguing with your community, critical to undoing some of the myths that are out there. And also just kind of breaking down, where people are versus what's actually happening in the schools, because there's a very big difference between the two, unfortunately. And I think you're right that there are parents, community members who come to these meetings or these issues in good faith, right? And they're upset or concerned. And that takes a response from the school, and the school has to be willing to have that conversation. And so dialogue with community, we started some dialogue sessions this past year that I'm really excited for. They're kind of small, but growing. And then the other thing I'm working on is hopefully getting my entire board to agree to do a dialogue workshop with an organization called Braver Angels. There are several out there that do this kind of work, but about disagreeing better, having better conversations, not letting things get so hot and heated, and really just sort of defusing some of the very difficult issues that we find ourselves arguing about for hours and hours and meetings. I think the more, he's right, the more we're able to talk to each other, the more we're able to see each other as humans rather than social media accounts, the better off we're going to be.
That's good. Well, I'm going to kick this back over to Julie because we are over time by a couple of minutes. But I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been very informative, and a lot of people in the chat are saying the very same thing, and they're looking forward to getting the follow-up information.
Yeah, and I see people still coming in. So I think there was a time, maybe you had a time change or a time zone thing. We are actually ending right now, but we will have, this has been recorded. So we do have a YouTube channel. So if you're looking for events we've done in the past, you can definitely go check that out. I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Rogers for coming tonight and speaking and for taking on this study. We think it's such important information, and I just want you to share it with everybody everywhere. And we intend to do a lot more content around this. Really think this is an important topic to educate people on, because I think this does reach people regardless of political party, so it's so important. Thank you so much to Aletha and to Lauren for taking the time to join us and share their stories. We really value that information and that real life experience. I think it puts a light on everything that Dr. Rogers was trying to say. I hope everybody has a really great evening. Thanks for joining.